the bridge was very much symbolic for the Russian regime of their sort of reassertion of control over that territory. So for the Russians, there's probably a perception that they need to restore that red line that they claim to have drawn around infrastructure like the Kerch Bridge, both to restore credibility amongst their own domestic public, but also I suppose they would be hoping to deter the Ukrainians from subsequent similar action through damage to both critical infrastructure, but also the terrorization of the Ukrainian civilian population. Yeah, I expect it to be fairly futile in terms of what the Russians are trying to achieve through this. But you would expect that as the bad news mounts for them on the battlefield in coming months, and as perhaps the Ukrainians conduct more similar strikes like the ones they've done so far, you could see an intensification of their missile campaign against Ukrainian cities. So in terms of how many they've got, it's very hard to say. They may well be running short of some of their more modern, precise capabilities, things like the caliber, but they do also have large numbers of stockpiled holdovers from the Soviet era, things like the Kh-22, and they do appear to have prioritized manufacturing additional calibers. For example, one of the factories related to the project hired 500 new employees somewhere towards the beginning of the war. So they may well have replaced some of the stocks they've burned through. Nonetheless, they've used a pretty phenomenal number of missiles so far, over 2,000 cruise and ballistic missiles. So at some point, I think there will be constraints on their magazine depth. In terms of what Surovikin will bring to the mix or what he'll do differently, I think it's too early to say. I mean, what we know about him is that he has had a career that's been blighted by accusations of both corruption and brutality, going all the way back to 1991 when he was one of the few Russian or Soviet officers who actually fired on protesters during the coup against Gorbachev. So, that may be some insight into how he'll approach it. But then again, the Russian approach has already been quite brutal. It won't necessarily change much. As to what he'll do militarily, it's very hard to say. And it's also a question of what he can do militarily, because the situation for the Russians is a very difficult one for any commander to really extricate them from. They just don't have enough troops to man this very extended front line. They currently have to defend against Ukrainian counterattacks. Mobilized units will take a lot of time to turn into cohesive formations. And if all you're doing is pouring freshly mobilized recruits into existing demoralized formations, that probably creates more problems than benefits. So in many ways, I don't think the appointment of a new general matters, because I think the situation is for them in many ways beyond the capacity of any particular general to fix, irrespective of his capabilities. And then we don't really know what his capabilities are in this case.